When I inherited $7 billion following my billionaire father's funeral, the world assumed I'd won life's cruel lottery. Reporters called me the lucky heir. Old friends reappeared with their practiced condolences. And my own children, Emma and Luke, sat across from me at the mahogany dining table I'd grown up around, their eyes not on the framed photos of their grandfather, but on the envelope holding the will. My father's funeral had been a production. All marble columns, imported lilies, and people pretending they hadn't despised him in private. I stood there in a black suit that didn't quite fit anymore, hearing the eulogies about vision and legacy, while remembering the man who once told me, affection is just another form of leverage. By the time the lawyers finished reading the documents, I already knew it wasn't love he'd passed down. It was control, packaged in assets and trusts. I was 45, too old to be anyone's pawn, but apparently still young enough to be tested. The estate papers listed my name as the primary beneficiary, a move that shocked everyone, including my kids. I saw it in the way Emma's jaw tightened, how Luke's fingers tapped against his phone instead of the table. They'd always been good at hiding entitlement behind politeness, but not that day. The ink wasn't even dry when Emma asked, "So, what happens to us?" It wasn't grief in her voice. It was calculation, and in that instant I understood exactly what kind of game was about to start. By evening, the condolence calls turned into subtle interrogations, from my ex-wife, from distant cousins, from advisors who suddenly remembered my number. Everyone wanted a piece, but it was the message I got from Luke that night that hit hardest. "Dad, since it's all ours now, we should start making decisions together." Ours. As if I'd inherited on their behalf. As if my father's empire, the steel companies, the offshore accounts, the land in Dubai, belonged to a committee of entitlement. I sat in my father's study, the same room where he used to negotiate contracts worth billions while I did homework in silence, and realized something brutal. Every generation in this family had been trained to devour the one before it. The next morning I visited the family vault, mostly out of obligation. The scent of old paper and cedar hit me like memory. The last time I'd stood there, my father had been alive, lecturing me about discipline. Now I was alone, holding the key he'd once refused to hand me. Inside, beyond the ledgers and sealed boxes, I found an envelope labeled simply, "For whoever earns it." No name, no instructions, just that phrase in his exact handwriting. When I opened it, there was no check, no deed. Just a single USB drive and a handwritten note. "You'll understand the real inheritance when you decide who deserves nothing." I didn't know it yet, but that line would come to define everything that followed. The calls, the betrayals, the audits, the court filings. It was the first clue in a test he'd designed long before his death, a final lesson in power disguised as family. By the second week after the funeral, the mansion didn't feel like mine anymore. It was full of whispers, footsteps that paused when I entered, and the subtle sound of drawers opening somewhere down the hall when they thought I couldn't hear. My daughter Emma had moved into the guest wing temporarily, she said, to help me manage the transition. Her brother Luke stayed in a nearby hotel but came every day to check on the accounts. Their words were polite, but their tone was sharp-edged, testing boundaries like lawyers in training. The lawyers themselves had begun to circle too. My father's old firm, a man named Pierce who had handled the estate for 40 years, suddenly became impossible to reach without scheduling through assistants. When I finally cornered him in his office, he looked uncomfortable, like a priest who'd lost faith in his own gospel. "There are certain provisions your father left," he said carefully, tapping the desk with a gold pen. "Conditions related to disbursement." He slid a file toward me, but his hand lingered on it as if reluctant to let it go. Inside, the first clause read, "Full ownership contingent upon moral audit of direct descendants." I stared at those words, trying to understand. "Moral audit?" I asked. Pierce shrugged. "Your father was creative." That night I sat in his old study, going through hundreds of files he'd left behind. Property deeds, digital transfers, encrypted folders marked with years instead of names. It was like trying to map the inside of a maze built by a man who believed confusion was a virtue. By day 3, the messages from Emma and Luke became demands disguised as concern. "You can't handle this alone," Emma said over dinner, her voice sweet but rehearsed. "We should move the main accounts under joint management before the press starts asking questions." Luke nodded, playing his role. It's for protection, Dad. You know how these things can be misinterpreted. I looked at them, both raised in private schools, fluent in financial jargon before they could drive, and realized I'd failed to teach them one thing: restraint. I told them I'd think about it. That was mistake number one. The next morning, I found my father's old assistant, Claire, waiting in the driveway. She was in her 60s now, gray hair pulled back, the same calm eyes she'd always had when the world around her burned. "He warned me this would happen," she said before I could even invite her in. She handed me another envelope. "He asked me to give you this when your children started using the word ours." Inside was a single sheet of paper, neatly typed, "Start with accounts 0743B. That's where they'll strike first." The handwriting at the bottom was unmistakably his. That night, I checked. The account, a secondary fund tied to the old family trust, had already been accessed. Not emptied, not yet, but transfers were scheduled. Someone had set up automatic movements to a new LLC registered under a name that looked familiar: E&L Holdings. Emma and Luke. I canceled the transfers, locked the accounts, and called the bank manager directly. He hesitated, said there was family authorization. I asked him to send proof. A few hours later, an email arrived with scanned signatures, mine included. Only they weren't mine. The loops on the J were too perfect, the pressure too even. They'd hired someone, maybe one of Luke's college friends with a knack for digital forgery. I didn't confront them right away. Instead, I called a man I hadn't spoken to in 20 years, a forensic accountant named Dominic who used to work for my father before being fired for moral disagreements. Dominic picked up after 2 rings. "He warned me you'd call someday," he said, almost amused. "So how bad is it?" I told him enough. He agreed to help on one condition: no police yet. We trace everything first. For 2 weeks, we built a map: shell companies, offshore accounts, silent partnerships that Emma and Luke had quietly seeded in the background. They weren't just greedy. They were methodical. My daughter had even filed paperwork to rebrand one of the smaller trusts under her own management, claiming misdirection of fiduciary responsibility. My son had purchased a media consultancy firm the day after the funeral, probably to shape public perception in case this went public. They weren't acting out of impulse. They were building a siege. The silence in the mansion grew heavier. I started hearing my father's voice in the walls, not literally, but in echoes of his discipline. "Emotion is expensive," he used to say. "Never let them see what you value." He'd spent decades teaching me that everything had a market price: an affection, loyalty, grief. I used to hate that worldview. Now I understood it was armor. On the 21st day after the funeral, the first formal notice arrived: petition for co-executorship, filed by Emma and Luke. They were demanding shared control of the estate, citing concerns of mental instability due to grief. I almost laughed when I read that line. My own children were trying to have me declared temporarily unfit to manage my own inheritance. That night I sat at my father's desk again, staring at the note he'd left. "You'll understand the real inheritance when you decide who deserves nothing." I poured myself a drink, opened the USB drive, and saw folders labeled Phase 1, Phase 2, Contingency. Inside Phase 1 were dozens of recordings, phone calls, board meetings, surveillance footage. My father had been documenting everyone around him for years. One folder was titled Descendants. I hesitated before opening it. Inside were records of my children's transactions, transcripts of conversations they'd had with his lawyers, even before his death. My father had anticipated their betrayal before they did. By morning, the sense of shock had turned into something colder: resolve. I realized this wasn't about grief anymore. It was about legacy. He'd left me the empire not to enjoy it, but to test whether I'd become him or end the cycle. And maybe the only way to end it was through precision, not mercy. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with the glow of the monitors painting the study in cold blue light, staring at my father's archive like it was some kind of cursed inheritance. Proof that every handshake in this family came with an asterisk. The files on Emma and Luke went back years. Property transfers, digital ledgers, even recordings from private dinners I'd thought were moments of trust. My father had paid investigators to shadow his own grandchildren, and now, posthumously, He'd handed me their sins wrapped in a flash drive. It was grotesque, but it was also leverage. By dawn, I had a plan. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with the glow of the monitors painting the study in cold blue light, staring at my father's archive like it was some kind of cursed inheritance, proof that every handshake in this family came with an asterisk. The files on Emma and Luke went back years. Property transfers, digital ledgers, even recordings from private dinners I'd thought were moments of trust. My father had paid investigators to shadow his own grandchildren, and now, posthumously, he'd handed me their sins wrapped in a flash drive. It was grotesque, but it was also leverage. By dawn, I had a plan. I called Dominic again. We're going to make them think they're winning, I told him. I need quiet audits of all trusts under my signature, but I don't want them frozen yet. Just mirrored. He understood immediately. We set up shadow accounts, digital twins of every major asset. Anything they touched, we'd see first. Anything they moved, we'd copy. Within days, the system was live. Meanwhile, I started the performance. I invited Emma and Luke for dinner at the estate, told them I'd decided they were right. That joint management made sense. Emma arrived first, dressed like she was heading to a board meeting, her eyes scanning the room as if calculating square footage. Luke showed up late, already talking about strategic public messaging. I poured wine, smiled, told them I was stepping back for a while. You two should take charge of the day-to-day, I said. Emma's relief was immediate. That's the smart move, Dad. You've been through a lot. Luke nodded, hiding a grin behind his glass. I excused myself early that night, went upstairs, and listened from the balcony as they stayed below, already discussing which assets to streamline. Within 48 hours, they'd moved $5 million out of a dormant subsidiary into a shell account in the Caymans. I let it happen. The mirrored account captured everything: routing numbers, timestamps, beneficiary codes. Dominic was meticulous. They're overconfident, he said on the phone. They're setting themselves up for criminal liability without realizing it. That was the thing about entitlement. It made people sloppy. At the same time, I began reconstructing my father's network. His old secretary, Claire, connected me with a retired judge who'd owed him favors. Dominic found 2 auditors who had quietly built careers cleaning up corporate messes that never made the news. Within a week, I had a covert team. Not mercenaries, just professionals who understood silence. We worked out of the old wine cellar. My father had converted part of it into a secure server room during the early 2000s. Paranoid about data theft before cloud storage even existed. Irony never dies in my family. Then came the first confrontation. Emma stormed into my office one afternoon waving a printed report. The accounts aren't syncing right, she said. There's a discrepancy. I looked up slowly. Discrepancy? Over $2 million, she snapped. It's missing. I studied her face, calm as ice. Then find it. You're in charge, remember? She stared at me, searching for a tell. You're not upset? Why would I be? Mistakes happen. That's when I saw the first crack: uncertainty. She wasn't used to indifference as a defense. That night Luke called. Dad, Emma's losing it. She thinks you're setting her up. I let him talk. You two wanted responsibility, I said. Now you have it. I hung up before he could respond. Behind the calm, the net was tightening. Dominic sent me updates every few hours. They've now rerouted funds through 3 intermediaries, he said. I can tie every transaction back to their personal devices. You'll have a timeline airtight enough for any court. By the end of that month, the pattern was complete. The fake transfers led into my mirrored system, creating a perfect record of fraud committed in their names. All I needed was a trigger. But I waited. Patience is the only real power left to men like me. On the 31st day the bank called, someone had tried to liquidate the secondary trust entirely. I told them to approve it. The funds moved. The mirror captured it. And within hours, Emma and Luke thought they'd won. They came to see me together, glowing with triumph disguised as concern. Dad, Emma said, it's time to think about legacy planning. You can't manage this forever, Luke added. We found a way to modernize the structure. It'll be cleaner, more efficient. I watched them talk like investment bankers pitching to a client, not a son and daughter speaking to their father. When they finished, I nodded. You're right, I said. It's time. That night I transferred the mirrored documentation, the full trail of their embezzlement, forged signatures and internal emails, to my lawyer, and to the authorities under sealed order. I wasn't pressing charges yet, just filing documentation, time-stamped, notarized. I wanted it on record. Then I wrote 2 letters, one for each of them, identical except for the salutation. The inheritance isn't what you think it is. You've both already spent your share. But the real blow came 2 days later. My father's final clause in the estate triggered automatically after 30 days of disputed management. Any beneficiary involved in unauthorized transactions forfeited their claim. My lawyer confirmed it. Emma and Luke's shares reverted to a charitable foundation my father had set up decades earlier. I hadn't known about that clause. He'd hidden it under layers of supplemental codicils. When Pierce, the estate lawyer, called to inform me, he sounded half afraid, half impressed. "Your father was a chess player," he said, "and you apparently were the final piece." The aftermath wasn't cinematic. No shouting, no grand confrontation, just silence. Emma stopped coming to the estate. Luke sent one text, "You ruined everything." I didn't reply. In truth, I hadn't ruined anything. I just let gravity do its job. The more they grabbed, the faster they fell. Weeks later, Dominic came by with the finalized audit. "They're done," he said, setting a thick folder on my desk. "You can press charges if you want, or just let the clause handle it." I looked at the papers, proof of betrayal neatly bound, and thought of my father's note again. "You'll understand the real inheritance when you decide who deserves nothing." I finally did. The foundation absorbed their shares, funding scholarships for students who'd never see the inside of a private jet. I kept the rest, enough to maintain the estate, nothing more. For the first time, the house was quiet, not hollow, but part of me couldn't help wondering if this was all his design. If my father had orchestrated one final experiment to see whether I'd choose revenge or release. Maybe it didn't matter. The result was the same. When the clause triggered, the silence didn't last long. Within 48 hours, headlines began to ripple through the business press. Heirs lose multi-billion inheritance after dispute. Journalists circled like gulls over an oil spill. My phone filled with requests for comment, half of them pretending concern, the rest looking for blood. I said nothing. Emma and Luke said plenty. They hired a PR firm, the same one that had once handled my father's scandals, and started giving interviews about undue influence, painting me as an unstable recluse manipulated by advisors with ulterior motives. They looked composed on camera, grief polished into strategy. I watched one interview in my office. Emma's voice barely trembled as she said, "We just want transparency. This isn't about money, it's about fairness." Behind her, Luke nodded, jaw tight, playing the role of loyal brother. They'd learned well. What they didn't know was that every word they spoke on live television strengthened my position. The estate's lawyers filed their sound bites as evidence of interference with fiduciary proceedings. My father's will was ironclad, and his clause left no room for emotional appeals. Still, perception mattered. And soon my name became a headline too. Billionaire heir accused of manipulating his own children. That was when I realized the real war wasn't about assets anymore. It was about narrative. My father had fought his battles in boardrooms and courts. I'd have to fight mine in public, where truth is just an opinion that trends long enough. Dominic suggested we let them overextend. "They're spending hundreds of thousands on PR," he said. "Let them burn through liquidity. Every dollar they spend strengthens the foundation's claim of fiscal irresponsibility." I agreed. So I withdrew further from sight, appearing calm, predictable, almost defeated. I let them believe the storm was working. Meanwhile, I prepared the quiet strike. I began feeding verified financial documents, not through journalists, but through the Foundation's annual report. Public, transparent, irrefutable. Every figure checked by independent auditors. It painted a picture of responsibility, while their media appearances grew shriller. Within weeks, the narrative shifted. Father funds education. Children fight over lost fortune. The contrast was surgical. Even their allies began to distance themselves. But Emma wasn't finished. She filed a motion in court to contest the will's validity, alleging my father had been mentally unfit when drafting the clause. I almost admired her precision. She'd found a narrow path. If she could prove he'd been incompetent, everything unraveled. Luke followed her lead, signing affidavits and statements. Their lawyers subpoenaed me for deposition. The day of the deposition was gray and wet. The conference room smelled like stale coffee and legal paper. Emma sat across from me, immaculate in a navy suit, her expression neutral. Luke avoided eye contact. Their attorney started with gentle questions, then edged toward insinuation. Mr. Hale, were you aware of your father's deteriorating condition in the months preceding his death? I answered calmly. My father didn't deteriorate. He planned. The lawyer leaned in. So you're saying he foresaw all this, including your children's disinheritance? I met his gaze. He didn't foresee it. He measured it. When the session ended, Emma caught me by the elevators. You're destroying us, she said quietly. Her voice cracked just once. For a second, she wasn't the strategist. She was the child I'd once carried on my shoulders at the zoo, pointing at lions. I wanted to say something human. Instead, I said, "You did that yourselves." The doors closed before she could answer. Over the following weeks, Dominic uncovered something neither of us had expected. Buried in my father's offshore archives were trust structures tied not to the family, but to his oldest employees, the ones who'd stayed through the lean years. They'd been promised lifetime dividends, but my father's death had frozen the accounts. The clause releasing their payments depended on completion of moral audit by successor. I was that successor, which meant I could choose. The same document that stripped my children also allowed me to restore what my father had withheld from those who'd earned it. I signed the authorization. Within days, pension deposits and backdated payments began reaching people who'd long since given up hope. Former foremen, secretaries, clerks. Letters started arriving. One from a retired steelworker in Pittsburgh simply read, "You fixed what he broke. Thank you." Another from a widow said, "I can keep my house now." The press noticed. Suddenly the story shifted again. Heir honors workers over wealthy heirs. The same outlets that had crucified me began rewriting their tone. Public sympathy returned, slow but steady. Emma and Luke doubled down. They staged another interview, this time claiming the foundation's generosity was a PR move to mask exploitation. But the timing betrayed them. Every dollar was verifiable, every transaction public. Viewers saw through it. The comments turned cruel. The empathy they'd tried to weaponize evaporated. By the third month, their lawyers withdrew. Too much cost, too little chance. The court dismissed their motion with prejudice. I watched the ruling stream in live. No celebration, no relief, just quiet inevitability. The same kind of silence that followed my father's death. One evening, I found an old recording on the USB drive I hadn't noticed before. The timestamp was from 2 years before his death. In it, my father's voice, older, rasping, said, "If you're hearing this, the children have failed the test. Don't hate them for it, hate me. I built this hunger." Then silence. For a long moment, I just sat there, listening to the hum of the old speakers, realizing that even from the grave he was still teaching through cruelty. When I finally looked out the window, the estate grounds were quiet, the lake still, the reflection of the house steady on its surface. I thought about what comes after revenge. There's no satisfaction in victory, only the absence of noise. But the world wasn't done testing me. A week later, a new message arrived, anonymous email, encrypted. The subject line read, "He left more than $7 billion. I opened the email at 2 a.m. because that's when ghosts usually knock. It came from an encrypted address using my father's initials and an old company domain that had supposedly been dissolved a decade earlier. No greeting, no sign-off, just a single line of text. There is another ledger. The foundation is only the surface. Attached was a small PDF named folioware13b.pdf. I hesitated before opening it. By then I'd learned that in my family, every revelation carried a cost. The document was brief, 2 pages. A list of 23 offshore entities spread across jurisdictions I'd only ever heard whispered about in my father's circles. Mauritius, Seychelles, Liechtenstein. Each entity was linked to assets already declared in the estate but marked with asterisks and footnotes in his handwriting, held in reserve until evaluation complete. At the bottom, a single sentence typed in all caps, "Successor may execute if moral criteria met, moral criteria." Those words again, like some private theology he'd invented. I forwarded the file to Dominic, who called me an hour later, voice clipped with adrenaline. "These accounts aren't in any public registry," he said. We're talking about shadow assets, probably tens of billions. If this is real, your father's net worth was never 7 billion. It was closer to 20. For a long moment, I said nothing. The number didn't register as money. It registered as magnitude. 20 billion wasn't inheritance, it was an empire. Enough to move markets, fund wars, rewrite economies. My father had hidden it not from the public, but from his own heirs. Maybe even from the government. We traced the first line item to a shipping consortium registered in Cyprus. On paper, it looked defunct, but its bank trail led to active accounts moving small amounts every quarter like a heartbeat. The signatures were digital, using a key last authorized the month before his death, meaning someone else had access. I asked Dominic if it could be Pierce, the old estate lawyer. Unlikely, he said. Pierce doesn't have that kind of access. Whoever's running this knows the infrastructure. Maybe Claire? I doubted it. Claire was loyal, but she wasn't technical. 2 days later, another email arrived. Same sender, this time with coordinates. A small private storage facility outside Zurich, registered under one of the shell companies. A note below. He called it the archive. Key number 7, I didn't tell anyone, not Dominic, not Claire. I booked a flight under a secondary passport my father had arranged years ago for emergency travel. It still worked. At Zurich Customs, no questions. I rented a car and drove out to the facility. A nondescript building surrounded by pines, the kind of place where anonymity was the only service offered. The clerk handed me a small brass key without comment. Unit 7. Inside was no treasure room, no gold bars or paintings. Just a metal desk, an aging desktop computer, and 3 sealed envelopes stacked neatly. On the monitor's corner, taped in fading ink, was a note. To my successor, trust no executor. I opened the first envelope. Inside was a USB drive identical to the one I'd already found, labeled Phase the 3rd. The second held photocopies of notarized statements, directives to transfer funds to the foundation in case of moral failure of lineal descendants. That part I already knew. The third envelope was different. It contained a single page of handwritten coordinates followed by 3 words. Project Continuum completed. The computer required a password. I guessed 3 times, birthdays, initials, combinations of dates. On the 4th try, I typed the name of my mother, who'd died when I was 16. The screen blinked, then loaded. What I found wasn't an account ledger. It was correspondence, emails, meeting notes, drafts of contracts between my father and government officials across multiple countries. He'd been building something far beyond business, an interlocking system of funding pipelines that channeled private wealth into public infrastructure projects under false flags. Bridges, hospitals, clean energy initiatives, all legitimate on the surface, but every one of them skimmed profit through silent subsidiaries. Billions had been siphoned into Project Continuum, and then, 1 folder deeper, I saw my own name. Files dated just weeks before his death. Memos titled Successor Integration, Psychological Evaluation, Phase 4 Trigger. He'd been tracking me, testing me. Notes described my decisions after his illness, the way I handled smaller trusts, even the tone of my public statements. It read less like a father's observation and more like a dossier compiled by intelligence analysts. Under evaluation character, he'd written 1 line. He resists corruption but confuses restraint for virtue. I shut off the monitor and sat there in the dim room, hearing only the low hum of ventilation. For the first time, I realized the inheritance wasn't money, it was continuity. My father had built a machine that fed itself long after he was gone, and by inheriting it, I'd become its operator whether I wanted to or not. Back in the car, I called Dominic. "There's more," I said. He asked how much. "Enough to rewrite the estate entirely." He exhaled sharply. "Then you have a choice, expose it or own it." That night in a Zurich hotel, I watched news about my children's last desperate attempt. They'd filed a civil suit in European courts claiming I'd hidden offshore funds. They weren't wrong. They just didn't know how deep it went. I could clear my name with what I'd found, but doing so would expose my father's entire network, implicating people who still held power in multiple countries. It would destroy the foundation, too. I stared at the note again. Project Continuum. Complete it. Maybe he'd known that transparency would be my instinct, and that the real test was whether I could resist it. Maybe he wanted me to protect the machine, not dismantle it. But protection meant complicity. When I flew back home, the air around the estate felt heavier. Claire was waiting by the door, eyes tired. "You found something," she said simply. I nodded. "Then it's your turn to decide what kind of Hale you are," she said. For weeks I did nothing. I let the lawyers handle the noise, the press cycle fade. I walked the property at dawn, the way my father used to, tracing the same gravel paths. The wealth sat like a weight I couldn't spend. Then one morning a courier delivered a package, no return address, only my name typed in small letters. Inside was a thin hard drive and a note in a handwriting I didn't recognize. "If you won't finish Continuum, others will. Decide before they do." That was when I realized the machine hadn't stopped with him. It had already begun to move on its own. The hard drive was warm when I plugged it in, as if it had been handled just moments before. It contained no labels, no partitions, just a single folder named Continuum Active. Inside, live data feeds, financial transactions, encrypted messages, even satellite pings tied to vessels registered under the old Hale Maritime Group. The machine was still breathing. Someone had kept it alive, maintained, automated. Each transaction had a signature. C. I thought it was Claire at first, but she'd never have access to this scale. Then Dominic called. "You need to get out of the estate tonight," he said, voice stripped of all calm. "I just got an alert. Someone's tried to breach our mirror accounts. It's internal." I asked how. He hesitated. "The encryption key they used, it's your father's. Someone's reactivated his credentials." For a moment, the air around me felt thinner, like the walls themselves were listening. "Who has it?" I asked. "We don't know yet. But the signal came from inside the country. Near you." I shut down the computer, took the drive, and walked out into the night. The estate stretched behind me like a museum of wrong decisions, windows glowing faintly, rooms full of ghosts that looked like family portraits. I drove without destination until the road blurred into mist, ended up in a small coastal town 3 hours away. Checked into a motel under a fake name, curtains closed, laptop open. The data kept updating. Every 20 minutes new numbers appeared. Shipments logged, payments processed, foundations donating to shell NGOs. Continuum wasn't dormant. It had become a self-sustaining global laundering network disguised as philanthropy. My father hadn't built a legacy. He'd built a system immune to death. And now whoever had the key was steering it. At dawn, Dominic called again, his voice lower this time. I traced the origin. It's not random and it's not foreign. The signal's coming from a foundation office downtown, one that's supposed to be under your control. I opened the files and cross-checked the IP signatures. He was right. The breach had come from within my own infrastructure, which meant someone close, someone who had access to the recovery servers. Claire, or someone using her. I called her immediately. It rang 8 times before she answered. "I was expecting this call," she said quietly. "You shouldn't have gone to Zurich." My chest tightened. "So you sent the package?" "No," she said. "But I know who did." He called himself Custodian. "Your father's final executor. He contacted me before he died. Said if the heir failed to stabilize Continuum, the Custodian would take over. He believed the system couldn't rely on a single person anymore." "And what does that mean?" I asked, her silence stretched. "It means the project is now autonomous. You can't just unplug it. If you try, it will liquidate its assets automatically, every account, every holding, and distribute the funds globally. Billions will vanish into nothing." I stared at the screen. The graphs were already moving faster, like a pulse accelerating. "So what happens to me?" I asked. Claire's answer was almost kind. "You were never meant to control it. You were meant to prove whether it should survive you." The line went dead. For hours I sat there, watching the network replicate, one transfer spawning 3 more. Dominic sent another message. "If you want to stop this, there's one option left. Trigger the final clause. Your father's dead man switch." He attached a document. The heading read, Phase WARF, Termination Protocol. Below it, a single instruction. All nodes require simultaneous override from the primary heir's biometric authorization. Meaning I had to return home to the estate vault and end it from the source. I drove back before dusk through rain that blurred the world into streaks of silver. The gate stood open. The house was dark except for one light in the study. Inside, the air felt heavy, electric, like it remembered me. I went straight to the vault, entered the code, pressed my hand against the sensor. A low hum filled the room as screens lit up across the walls, maps, ledgers, moving data. Then a voice, calm and mechanical, came through the speakers. Successor authorization detected. Final continuity check in progress. For a second, I thought it was some recorded AI. Then the voice shifted slightly and I froze. It was my father's, digitized, preserved. If you're hearing this, you've reached the end of the maze, it said. Continuum exists because nations fail. It exists because people like you still believe in fairness. You can destroy it, but if you do, you'll destroy the balance it sustains. I stared at the terminal, rain pounding the windows. What balance? I whispered. The voice continued. The world's stability was never built on truth, son. It was built on control. Then the system asked for confirmation. Terminate network? And my hand hovered over the keyboard, the cursor blinking like a heartbeat. Ending it meant wiping away everything. Every hidden dollar, every foundation, every lifeline to corruption. But keeping it meant becoming the same man I'd spent my life trying not to be. For a long time, I just stood there, the hum of the servers like distant breathing. The scent of rain mixing with dust. Finally, I pressed Y. The screens flashed white, the data lines collapsed, and one by one, the maps vanished. The hum stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. Like the house itself had exhaled for the first time in decades. I didn't move. Somewhere in the dark, I thought I heard the faint echo of my father's voice again. Maybe a glitch, maybe not. You finally chose something, it said. Then the lights went out. When the lights died, the silence that followed felt different. Not peaceful, but stripped bare, like the world was holding its breath. The hum of continuum was gone, and with it the invisible rhythm that had pulsed through my family for generations. I stood there in the dark vault, surrounded by the ghosts of transactions that no longer existed. Billions had vanished, not stolen, not spent, just erased. My phone buzzed once, a message from Dominic. It's done. Everything's offline. But you need to see this. No attachments, no explanation. Then another message, this time from an unknown number. You shouldn't have done that. I stared at the screen until it dimmed, the glow fading like the last pulse of the machine I'd just killed. When I walked out of the vault, the entire house felt heavier, as if gravity itself had thickened. Rainwater dripped from the eaves, the air sharp with ozone. Claire was waiting by the door, drenched, a coat wrapped around her like armor. You ended it, she said. Yes. Do you even know what you've done? I looked at her. For the first time in my life, yes. She shook her head slowly. Continuum wasn't just a network of money. It stabilized entire economies. It held debt for nations, distributed quiet aid under different names. You didn't just cut power, you erased the scaffolding holding up half the financial system. Then it deserved to fall, I said. She took a step closer, rain dripping from her hair. And what if it takes you down with it? Her voice trembled, not fear, but pity. I turned away. Then it's over. The next 48 hours unfolded like an earthquake under glass. Markets wavered without knowing why. NGOs and investment funds reported data corruption. A few governments quietly froze accounts tied to dormant Hale subsidiaries. No one said the word continuum, but I could see its shadow in every statement about technical anomalies and unforeseen liquidity disruptions. Dominic sent another message. You burned the root, but there are still branches. They'll come looking. I didn't reply. I didn't have the energy to explain that I hadn't acted out of revenge or virtue. I'd acted because I couldn't live inside a ghost any longer. 2 nights later, a black sedan appeared outside the gates. 3 men stepped out. No uniforms, no badges, just suits too clean for rain. I watched from the balcony as they knocked once, twice, then let themselves in. Claire met them in the foyer. One of them handed her a folder, then turned and left. She climbed the stairs and placed it on the table in front of me. They want to make sure the data stays gone, she said. Who are they? I asked. Investors, governments, people who prefer silence. She looked at me for a long moment. They're offering you immunity, in exchange for cooperation. And if I don't, then they'll rewrite the story. You'll become the villain who crashed the invisible economy. I opened the folder. Inside were printouts of old headlines, drafts of future ones, statements already prepared. Air collapses legacy in act of paranoia. My father had been right. Control wasn't about money. It was about narrative. I burned the folder in the fireplace. The paper curled, blackened, turned to ash without sound. They can tell whatever story they want, I said. Claire's eyes softened. Then you finally become him. No, I said quietly. I just stopped being afraid of him. She left before dawn. I haven't seen her since. Dominic's next call came from a blocked number. You're being audited internationally, he said. But there's something else. Before the network went down, a backup activated. A self-contained seed file encoded under your name. It's replicating. I closed my eyes. How much? A fraction of the original. Maybe 1%. But it's enough to rebuild. Can you stop it? Not without access to the original architecture. And you destroyed that. I thought for a long time before answering. Then let it rebuild, but not under my name. Transfer whatever remains to the foundation. Anonymous, no branding, no ownership. That's not how power works, he said. Then maybe it's how it ends. Weeks passed. The estate became quiet again, though not peaceful. The staff left. The reporters camped outside for a while, then gave up when the story lost its novelty. I sold half the property and turned the rest into a trust for educational programs. Real ones this time, not fronts. Every time I signed a check, I thought of my father's voice saying, "Affection is leverage." I wondered if he'd call this weakness or evolution. One evening, I drove down to the coast, to the same motel where I'd first seen Continuum breathing on the screen. The sea was calm, the horizon gray with fog. I sat there for hours watching waves erase themselves. My phone vibrated once, a message from Dominic again. It's over. Continuum dormant. Final checksum verified. Below that, a second line. But there's something you should know. Someone else accessed the Zurich archive 3 days ago. I stared at the message, heart sinking. Who? I typed. No response. Just silence. Then after a long minute, another buzz. It was a new number, new message. You erased the system, but not its idea. Continuum was never your father's. It belongs to whoever believes the world still needs it. I read it twice, then deleted it. That night, for the first time since the funeral, I slept. I dreamed of my father standing at the edge of the lake. Not young, not old, just there. He said nothing. I didn't either. When I woke, the sunrise cut through the mist, and for the first time in years, I couldn't hear the hum of machines beneath the silence. Years passed. Though time didn't move like it used to, it stretched thin and quiet, like a sound you stop hearing because it never changes. The estate became smaller in spirit, if not in size. I sold off the vineyards, the unused wings, the staff quarters, all the rooms built for people who'd never loved us. The money went to the foundation, now stripped of my father's name, renamed simply the Continuum School Fund. I liked the irony, turning the machinery of greed into something that taught people how to think. Reporters stopped caring. The market stabilized. My name faded from news crawlers. For the first time, obscurity felt like freedom. Claire disappeared completely. I heard a rumor she'd moved to Canada, another that she was living under a new name in Portugal. I never checked. Some ghosts deserve their peace. Dominic stayed longer, but even he drifted. One day he sent a message. There's nothing left to guard. Maybe that's good. Then he went offline. I kept the study almost empty now. One desk, one chair, and a box of what remained of my father's papers. Some nights I'd still hear his voice in my head, not scolding anymore, just present like a tinnitus of memory. I'd replay those last lines he'd recorded. Control is the scaffolding. When it's gone, things collapse. Maybe he was right, maybe wrong. I didn't care anymore. I was done building anything meant to last forever. Then one gray afternoon in early winter, Emma showed up at the gates. I hadn't seen her in nearly 5 years. She stood there in a dark coat, her face older, not hardened, just tired. I opened the door myself. You look well, I said. You don't, she replied, but her smile was faint, almost human. We sat in the kitchen where she used to steal cookies when she was 9. Why are you here? I asked. She looked down at her hands. Luke's gone, overdose. It wasn't dramatic. He just slipped away. I felt the words, but didn't feel emotion the way I should have. I'm sorry, I said, and meant it in a strange, hollow way. She nodded. I came because he left a note. For you. She handed me a folded piece of paper, edges soft from being held too long. Dad was right. You ended the machine. Maybe now we can stop trying to be like him. I stared at the words until they blurred. He forgave you, Emma said quietly. Maybe you should try doing the same. She stayed the night in one of the guest rooms, the same one that used to be hers, though it felt smaller now. We didn't talk much. In the morning, she left before sunrise, leaving her coffee half-finished just like her mother used to. After she left, I drove out to the lake. The water was still, the surface unbroken except for a single ripple from a falling leaf. I remembered the day of the funeral. The same reflection of gray sky, the same quiet that followed the speeches. My father had believed wealth was a kind of weather, something that shaped everything beneath it. I used to hate him for that. Now I realized he was half right. Wealth does shape people, but only until they learn to step outside its gravity. The years after that blurred together into a kind of slow forgiveness. The foundation grew quietly. I stopped attending meetings, just signed off on grants, renewable energy in small towns, scholarships for kids from steelworker families, programs teaching financial ethics, something my bloodline never mastered. I no longer lived like a billionaire. I sold the cars, kept one truck. The mansion turned into an office space for the foundation staff. I moved into the smaller house near the orchard, the one my mother had once decorated with her own hands. The walls still smelled faintly of cedar and lemon polish. Every day I'd walk the same path down to the lake, just to watch the light change across the water. Sometimes I'd still receive letters, people tracing old hail accounts, journalists chasing ghosts of Continuum. I ignored them. The system was gone, at least the parts that mattered. But one letter I couldn't ignore. It came with no return address written in neat cursive on heavy paper. I'm the custodian now. Continuum survived through intent, not infrastructure. You can't erase an idea, but you can choose what it becomes. There was no threat in the words, just inevitability. I didn't panic. Instead, I took the letter down to the dock and burned it. The flame reflected in the lake looked like a heartbeat fading. One night, maybe 10 years after I'd pressed that final key, a storm rolled in. Power flickered. The house groaned like something ancient remembering itself. I went into the study to close the windows, and there it was, a faint light blinking on the old terminal I'd kept disconnected since the purge. One pulse every few seconds, steady, patient. I approached slowly, not afraid, just curious. The screen came alive and a single line appeared. Legacy verification complete. Successor designation terminated. Then below it, Continuum final directive, rebuild through education. The system wasn't resurrected, it had evolved. My destruction had been its metamorphosis. I laughed then, softly, the sound startling in the quiet room. Maybe my father had known this would happen. Maybe that was the real endgame, to make me destroy the thing so that it could be reborn as something cleaner. I left the terminal running and went outside. The storm had passed. The air smelled of wet pine and iron. I stood at the edge of the property, looking out toward the horizon where the first light was breaking through clouds. Somewhere beyond that sky, money and power were still moving, the world still spinning on invisible gears. But for the first time, it wasn't my responsibility to keep it turning. I had stepped off the wheel. I walked down to the lake and watched the reflection of dawn ripple across the surface. And in that moment, I understood what my father's final words really meant. Not about control, not about power, but about surrender. The real legacy isn't what you build or destroy. It's what stops needing you to exist. In the years that followed, the world forgot my name, and that was the closest thing to grace I'd ever known. The foundation became its own organism, a quiet current beneath the noise of politics and finance. It had no face, no slogans, no trace of the Hale Empire, but I'd still catch glimpses of it in motion. A school built in Kenya with funds I never signed. A scholarship announcement from a university that had once sued my father's company. A flood relief program bearing the same 3 dots that had once marked Continuum's logo. I realized then that ideas never die, they just molt. My father's monster had shed its skin, and what crawled out wasn't beautiful, but it wasn't evil either. It was necessary. I was no longer at its center, just one of its discarded organs still beating out of habit. I didn't resent it. I envied it. I grew old quietly in the house by the orchard. The mirrors in the hall had dust along their edges, and the air smelled of wood smoke and rain. Some nights I'd sit by the window and think about the people who had once filled these walls. Emma as a child. Luke before the distance grew between us, my father at his desk. Claire moving through rooms like a shadow that understood too much. Sometimes I'd imagine them all still here, just out of sight, living parallel to me, untouched by consequence. Other nights I'd wake from dreams where the house was full again, the servers humming, lights flickering, voices arguing over numbers that didn't mean anything anymore. I'd wake up sweating, whispering to the dark, "It's over." But the dark never answered, and maybe that was mercy. Emma visited once a year now, sometimes with her daughter, a little girl who had my late wife's eyes and her own stubborn jaw. The first time I saw her, she ran straight past me to the apple tree and started climbing it barefoot. Emma started to scold her, but I stopped her. "Let her climb," I said. "That's what trees are for." I hadn't realized how long it had been since I'd said something simple without weighing it first. That night, Emma cooked dinner in the old kitchen, humming to herself while the child drew pictures on scrap paper. When they left, I found one taped to the fridge. It was a stick figure with gray hair standing beside a lake. Above it, in crooked letters, it said, "Grandpa's house where the air is soft." I kept it there. I still do. Sometimes I'd receive requests from journalists wanting to write retrospectives about the collapse of the Hale dynasty. I never replied. Let them write their myths. The truth didn't belong to anyone anymore. Dominic resurfaced briefly, sending me a postcard from Patagonia. On the back, just 5 words, "Balance found." "Hope you did." I smiled when I read it. I think he knew I had. The world moved on without me, as it should. The markets recovered, the government stabilized, the word continuum became just another footnote in economic history. But the foundation thrived quietly. Too quietly for news cycles to care. When I saw its reports, I noticed something almost poetic. The new board had stopped using monetary values in their summaries. Instead, they measured success in classrooms built, in water filters distributed, in lives reached. Numbers that couldn't be stolen. I hadn't taught them that. Maybe the idea had finally learned how to heal itself. Still, late at night when the wind moved through the orchard, I'd sometimes hear it, the faint hum that once came from the servers, not mechanical anymore but alive, like memory humming just below the surface of thought. It wasn't haunting. It was continuity, the pure kind my father had never understood. He'd tried to make permanence out of ownership. I'd found it in letting go. Maybe that was his lesson all along. One morning in my 70s, I walked down to the lake as I always did, coffee in one hand, the air cold enough to sting. The reflection was perfect, the kind of stillness that made you question whether time was even real. I thought of my father again, the man who'd taught me that power was control and control was safety. I smiled because I'd lived long enough to learn the opposite. Safety isn't control, it's the moment you stop needing it. The wind shifted, scattering the reflection. I felt light then, lighter than I'd been in decades. When I walked back to the house, I didn't feel haunted anymore. I felt finished in the quietest and cleanest sense of the word. The news later that year called it the quiet philanthropy revolution. They didn't mention my name. They didn't need to. It was better that way. The legacy had untangled itself from bloodlines, and that was the first time the word truly meant something. I died on a Tuesday. The hospice nurse said it was peaceful, that I'd just stopped breathing, but I'd felt it coming for weeks. The way the world began to fade around the edges, the way sound slowed down. The orchard was in bloom, white petals falling like snow, and Emma had been reading aloud near the window. I'd asked her once what she thought forgiveness looked like. She said maybe it's not looking back. I didn't answer then, but I thought about it as I closed my eyes for the last time. When they went through my desk, they found no keys, no passwords, no ledgers, just a single letter addressed to her. "Everything that mattered is already free," it said. "Don't rebuild what I burned. Just keep something alive that can't be bought." She buried me beside the lake under the same tree where her daughter used to climb. No mausoleum, no monument, just a small plaque that read, "Jonathan Hale, 1959-2034. He ended what built him." Years later, the Continuum School Fund became global. Its founders never used my surname, but Emma knew. Sometimes she'd visit the lake with her daughter, now grown, and tell her stories about the man who once held the world in his hands and chose to open them instead. People called it redemption, but she said it was quieter than that. He didn't change the world, she told her. He stopped letting it own him. At the edge of the water, the foundation installed a small solar lamp that glowed every night, flickering like a heartbeat. The wind carried the same scent of pine and rain, and in the ripples the house reflected smaller, softer, human again. And somewhere in the city, behind some nameless office door, A server still blinked once every hour, not running accounts anymore, just recording donations quietly, endlessly. Continuum lived, but this time not for control, only for connection. Because sometimes the truest revenge isn't destruction. It's peace. What about you? Where are you watching this from tonight?